So let's frame this in a broader perspective over here. I find this is useful to sort of understand. It gives me a skeleton to hang things on. And so if we look at land policy is really the umbrella, the long-term strategic framework that everything falls under. Land tenure is one of the sort of subcomponents of that, and that defines our relationship with regard to the land and with regard to natural resources. This could be done via statute, via formal law, or it could be customary as it's done in a lot of Africa. And then the operational side of land tenure is what's known as land administration. And typically, land administration is composed of a number of different tasks that operate on a daily level. I'm going to deal with 5 of these tasks, the top 5 over here. So if we look at land adjudication, that's really the process for defining land rights, who owns what. Cadastral surveying is the definition of boundaries and the collection of evidence and recording of where those boundaries are. And the cadastre is really an information system that manages this information. If we go to the other side and we look at land titling is the formal documentation of land rights, and that gets recorded in a land registry, which is also an information system which manages sort of the everyday, the changes and so on. Then if you look at the ones that I'm really not going to touch on, like land valuation and assessment, these are really depend on the information that exists in the 5 that I've mentioned before. Draws on information from the cadastre and the land registry. Land restitution and land reform don't operate in all countries, but are certainly key activities that may fall under land administration. I'm not going to deal with those today. We're just going to focus on these other ones over here. So let's look at the institutional arrangements, or the actors who are involved with land tenure administration. And these are the organizations or the agencies that are tied up with formalizing property rights. So these exist at different levels depending on what country you're working in. There are some agencies that exist at the national level, some at the state, province or department level, and some at the local or municipal level. So typically, if you're looking at the mapping agencies, they are typically at the national level. And in some instances, for example in Latin America, these have classically been part of the military institution. That has been changing, however, and I don't think you'll find that around many countries today. Then you may also have a national cadastre, which may accumulate all of the information from all the states, but may also just be a policy-making organization. And then in smaller countries, you may find actually a registry office that exists up at the national level. However, it's much more likely that you'll find these offices to exist at the state, province or department level. So the legal cadastre, which defines the spatial side of property rights, you're typically going to find that at a state or a province or department level, for example in Latin America and various countries in Africa. And the registry office, the same thing. You'll usually find that at the state level. So if we go down to the local or municipal county level, you may find that a lot of municipalities now are running what's called a cadastre, and many times that's a fiscal cadastre, which means they're for taxation purposes, for land taxation purposes. And quite often that's only operating in urban areas. So it's not a fully functional legal cadastre that defines the legal situation on the land, but of course you need to know who owns what in order to see who's responsible for the taxation. And then there are a few cases where registry offices are at the county level. And of course in the US is an example, and Ecuador is one of the other examples in Latin America. So how the land administration organizations operate really depends on the extent to which they've been deconcentrated or decentralized. And I wanted to spend a moment talking about the difference between deconcentration, decentralization, and devolution. Because if you look in the literature, there are many different definitions of this, but I think that primarily people will agree on the ones that I'm going to give you today. So deconcentration is where you've got a national organization that puts out arms down to the lower levels. However, it doesn't it doesn't transfer the decision-making powers. And so those local offices are always upwardly accountable to the national office. On the other hand, decentralization actually decentralizes the decision-making powers down to that local level. Devolution is really a step further than that, where it decentralizes but starts to involve actors other than government actors. So those are useful definitions to try and sort of weave your way through some of these words that have many different meanings. I should also mention that there are very important actors in the private sector, such as notaries, lawyers, private land surveyors, and so on. NGOs play a critical role in making the connection between the national, particularly the policy level, and interpreting that at the local level. And then civil society is playing an increasing role in creating these platforms whereby they will affect different policies and practices. And then, of course, the communities, where I think we're all beginning to realize that that's really where development and many of the things that we want to happen need to happen. And so reaching down into the communities is a key thing. So, for example, in Mexico, at the community level, there is some basic land registration that takes place at that level. So that would be an example of a community-based land registration. So if we unpack a little bit the cadastral registry system, I like to think of this as sort of that there's an infrastructure. So there's a spatial georeference framework which allows us to determine, to locate things uniquely in space. I haven't put down here the internet, but of course that is a key infrastructure that's impacting just about everything we do and increasingly impacting what agencies and organizations in developing countries do. Then we get to the measurement side of things, so would be something like the cadastral survey that I mentioned earlier, where you actually survey, get the information on where these parcels are, where people's rights are located, and that gets put into a cadaster, which, as I said earlier, is sort of an information system, and so there's a management component here. There's a management of spatial information in the cadaster, and there's a management process in the registry where you're managing legal information. What is a cadaster? Well, I like to think of it as an information system that answers 5 questions, and they're all pretty much spatial questions. So it needs to define where is the parcel, where in the world is the parcel, what the size is, the area, for example, how many hectares, what are the boundaries, what are the dimensions of the parcel boundaries, the distances and the directions of that so they can be relocated in the future, and then typically also defines a unique parcel identifier so we don't have to describe the parcel every time we refer to it, but it's sort of a shorthand reference system. On the registry side, we've got 4 key questions that need to be answered. Who holds those rights? The name, etc. Maybe the social security, some ID number. What rights they actually have acquired. How they've acquired those. Have they acquired them through inheritance? Have they acquired them through sale? And that needs to be documented. And when it's acquired. And many systems will actually stamp a time on there because that gives precedence. Time is key when you're registering documents. So the when is an important part of the registry as well. Okay, going a little bit more into titling and registration. Previously, the way that we thought about this was we had someone who was undocumented, didn't have property rights, but was occupying the land and may have been for generations. And we thought about, okay, you need to give that person a title. And that title was full property rights. And this turns out to be an expensive and probably not a viable way of approaching things. And so what's evolved is more of a continuum approach where we say, okay, let's recognize certain rights and then incrementally improve those rights. And so, for example, you might get a certificate that documents usufruct rights, use rights, development rights, and so on. And so this is what's being used more and more, are these other kinds of documents which give people some security of tenure and sort of move them up this ladder towards the full title over here. The other terms that you're going to come across within the registry world are these systems that are called registration of deeds or registration of title systems. And for many years, people argued about whether this system was a deed system or whether it was a title system. And quite frankly, that was a bit of a waste of time because it doesn't really matter. What matters is how it operates. You need to look inside of those systems and see how they operate. But essentially, the difference is the deeds record evidence of title, such as deeds, and in order to prove title, you have to do a search historically back in time, what's known as a chain of title in the US. In a title system, you can just go to a document, a register, or some book in the registry system, and you can get title out of it straight away. And in fact, as you look across the world, there are systems that look like title systems, but they're actually called deed systems. And so, as I said before, I don't think it's worth trying to sort of put these in one or two of the categories. What's more important is how is title proved and how does the system work. Another term that I need to just explain a little bit is the word private, because it has so many different meanings. Many people just assume that private means private individual ownership, and in countries in Africa for many years people have sort of had this debate about whether this is the right way to go with customary tenure and so on. However, there are things like private communal titles. Throughout Latin America, you have communities that have titles, and they may have many of the same rights as full title. They may have some restrictions, so that they may not be able to mortgage, they may not be able to sell, may not be able to alienate. So instead of using terms like private and ownership, it's best to look underneath there and say, what rights are we really talking about? What rights are conveyed? What can these people do legally?